Greetings. Welcome to the third lecture in Sealaska Heritage Institute's series celebrating Native American Heritage Month. I am Chuck Smythe, Director of the Culture and History Department. SHI has started construction of its arts campus in downtown Juneau, which will expand opportunities for education and art. If you are interested in making a donation to the arts campus, or submitting a letter of support to the Juneau Assembly for city funding, please visit sealaskaheritage.org/campus. The title of today's lecture is entitled, A Review of Tribal Governments. As you watch the lecture, we invite you to submit questions in the chat box in YouTube. Dr. Thomas has graciously agreed to answer questions at the end of his presentation. It is my privilege to introduce President Emeritus Tlingit and Haida Central Council, Dr. Edward K. Thomas. President Emeritus Thomas was born and raised in Craig, attended college and university in Alaska, and earned his master's in education administration at Penn State University. He was a commercial fisherman for more than 30 years and was very active in tribal government in Ketchikan, where he served as president of the Ketchikan Indian Corporation, president of the Ketchikan Alaska Native Brotherhood Camp Number 14, and president of the Ketchikan Tlingit and Haida Community Council. President Emeritus Thomas was elected president of the Central Council of the Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska in 1984 and served as president of the tribe until 2007. He has served on numerous boards and committees in Alaska and was a founding member of the Alaska Native Education Association. Nationally, he is the elected secretary of the National Congress of American Indians, has served on the White House Advisory Council for Tribal Colleges and Universities, and the National Advisory Council on Indian Education. And he has met with 6 United States presidents over the course of his career. Dr. Thomas.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Chuck. And greetings, everybody, and welcome to my very first virtual lecture. As mentioned, my name is Edward Thomas. I'm the President Emeritus of Tlingit Haida Central Council. I have 2 Tlingit names, Zahu and Shanskadek. I also have one Haida name, Skiliquidans. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Sealaska Heritage Institute and sponsors for this opportunity to share my thoughts on tribes going forward. And I especially thank all of you for joining with us in celebrating Native American Month. My presentation today will be primarily through PowerPoint, and I'll try to keep it moving so that there will be time for questions at the end. My presentation topics will include theories on our homeland occupancy, tribes as nations, importance of early tribal governance, outside influence that created change in the way tribal governments operate, tribal relations with the federal government, tribal governance as it is today, identifying some of the strengths, the importance of tribal governance today, and concluding with the limitation of tribal governments. It has been suggested that the indigenous people of North America came to this land on a land bridge between Alaska and Russia. It has been pointed out that there's not too much evidence of human life activity in Southeast Alaska prior to 10,000 years ago. This map shows the theory on how people in North America, or the indigenous people of North America, migrated from the Eastern Hemisphere. Now, I'm one of those that have not totally bought into the migration theory, and there are several arguments against that migration theory. For example, human remains that are over 10,000 years old have been found on Prince of Wales Island, and we all know that at approximately 10,000 years ago, Southeast Alaska was covered by ice because of the Ice Age. Another is that there is a village in Western Canada that is over 14,000 years old. It's important to point out that when people migrate, they take their language with them. And there are very few linguistical ties of the languages in North America to those languages in Asia and Russia. And finally, there really is no logical reason why humans could not have existed in the Western Hemisphere as it did on the Eastern Hemisphere. This is a scientific theory as to what happened during the Ice Age that covered Southeast Alaska. The red is what they estimate that the ice coverage included. And you could barely make out the land mass underneath the red. And that was about 10,000 years ago. Now, as the ice retreated from our homeland, we have legends about returning to our homeland. The Tluk-Ach-Adi clan, or the Sakai clan, has a legend about the Tlingit people who were anxious to come home, and they migrated, or they went underneath the glacier in the Stikine River. And as it melted, they wanted to come back so desperately that they actually went underneath the glacier as the river flowed under the glacier. When they got under the glacier, they found that most of the ice was already gone from Southeast Alaska, according to legend. This map shows where the Stikine River is, and then Haines, where the Tluk-Ach-Adi people call as their ancestral homeland. Southeast Alaska, what the Tlingits call Tlingit-Ani, is approximately 20 million acres in length, and it's made up of a lot of small islands. Now, legend tells us that the raven created the world and is responsible for the order of our universe. Now, this is the Tlingit perspective, that we've always been here. Now, Christians are familiar with the biblical version of creation that took place in 6 days. You may also be familiar with the Darwin origin of species, where it somewhat contradicted the biblical version. Now, it appears that our Tlingit legends are a combination of the two, meaning that we do have a creator, but our origin is on this land. The Tlingit and Haida people have been separate and distinct people from the beginning of time, by the Tlingit nation and the Haida nation. But Southeast Alaska is really the ancestral home of the Tlingit people. Legend has it that in ancient times, a portion of the Haida nation migrated to Southeast Alaska from Haida Gwaii, which was previously known as the Queen Charlotte Islands in British Columbia. And that is the true ancestral home of the Haida people. Now, this map, which was drawn up as a guesstimate as to the various clan territories prior to contact. And at the bottom, you can see Haida Gwaii, or where the Haida country was, and also shows the migration of part of the Haida nation to southern Southeast Alaska. Tsimshians came to Southeast Alaska much later. Actually, back in 1986, Metlakatla community was laid out in 1887, and Congress declared Annette Island Reserve as a Indian reservation in 1891. This map here, which is the southern part of Southeast Alaska and part of British Columbia, shows Port Simpson, where the original Metlakatla was located. It's called Old Metlakatla. And then they migrated to Annette Island, where where Metlakatla is situated right now. I want to go back to the issue of languages and dialects. This map of North America shows the indigenous language dialects of the very many indigenous peoples of North America. I do not have a map of Asia or of Russia that has similar dialects, but it is very clear that you do not have that many indigenous dialects that reflect our indigenous dialects over in Asia. I'm going to switch now to early tribal governance. In the Tlingit society, our nation was identified, or it identified us through our language, homeland, culture, social structure, our laws, and our art. Our people, the Tlingit people, were divided into two moieties, the eagle and the raven, and our marriage laws, or the traditional marriage laws, governed how our people married. In other words, the ravens did not marry ravens and the eagles did not marry eagles. They had to marry the opposite side, or the opposite part of the moiety. That was very important in keeping the bloodlines clean. At the moiety level, we also had very many traditions that crossed the social structure of the clans. When we had our police that brought our people together for ceremony. Now, the clans were the primary focus of governance in early times. Those clans identified with the territories. They determined where the communities would be located. They determined the leadership of the various clans. And very often that was determined through lineage, not necessarily through any kind of election. They also it was very important for clans to have ceremonies. The ceremonies are what really solidified a particular happening, such as a marriage or the determining of leadership and that sort of thing. The clans also were responsible for their own law and order, the education and discipline of the younger generation, so that our young people knew about the way our culture should operate, as well as how to survive uh, into the future. In our culture, the elders were very important in the way we carried on our tradition as our way of life, and they were very much respected, not only at the clan level, but throughout the entire Tlingit nation. Much of Tlingit law emphasized respect. It was very important for our people to have a governance in early times, primarily for survival, but also determine the interrelationships within a community, and also was very important in keeping peace between the communities and determine the geographic boundaries of the various clans and the communities within those clan territories. It also is important for the people to understand the consequences of violating traditional Tlingit law. It is also important in perpetuating and preserving inherent tribal sovereignty. Once again, also important in educating the next generation. When you talk about tribes, very often you will hear the word sovereignty used. In very simplistic terms, sovereignty is simply the right of a people to govern themselves. Inherent sovereignty is the sovereign rights of a people in governing themselves from the beginning of time. Inherent sovereignty is not something that is granted from one sovereign to another. It is the sovereignty that a people have had from the beginning of time. And very much of the Aboriginal societies in North America conduct their tribal governments around the theme of inherent sovereignty. In contemporary times, we'll talk a little bit about the uh, evolution of traditional tribes from traditional governance on into modern times. And in the contemporary times, we need to talk about the influences from foreign governments that influence the way we do business, as well as moving into the United States and federal tribal recognition. That's a lot of territory to cover, and I'll try to cover it very quickly in the interest of time. The foreign influences on Aboriginal tribes in North America come in two separate ways. In Alaska, it came about with our contact with Russian explorers. In the lower 48, it came about from people migrating from Europe, and then through the influence of manifest destiny, which I'll talk about very briefly here. In the beginning, the people on the East Coast, or the tribes on the East Coast, welcomed the Europeans to our country. They felt that the people brought things that were very interesting to them, and so they had a very friendly relationship. In Southeast Alaska, we had a very similar relationship with Russian traders. We welcomed them because it was a very good opportunity for us to trade with them some of our furs and other things for the metal objects as well as for things like rifles, etc. And we had very positive relationships early on. Manifest Destiny was a movement. It actually was a movement of the non-natives from the eastern shores of the United States westward. And the idea, or not the idea, but the principle was to conquer the Aboriginal tribes so that those people who were coming onto those lands could settle and develop those lands. That was the beginning of the Indian Wars. And many of those wars were settled between the United States and those tribes through treaties. In Southeast Alaska, Tlingit lands were taken simply through presidential declarations and or acts of Congress. Now, our tribal leaders very much resented that taking, but they were very determined to settle differences diplomatically. In early times, there were skirmishes between the Tlingit people and the American settlers, but there were never full-blown wars. Now, I have to point out that yes, that there was war between the Tlingits and the Russians in Sitka, and there was bombardments of Angoon and Cake by the United States Navy, but none of that ended up with the Tlingit or the Haida nations ever being conquered in war by foreign nations. And once again, we chose to settle our differences diplomatically. In the 1920s, the United States was faced with the challenge of trying to have relationships with many, many Indian tribes with very different backgrounds. And so the United States worked on and developed a standard methodology for recognizing tribal governments in various parts of the country. And I need to point out that during those times, not all tribal citizens were on reservations. So from the period of time through 1940s, the United States really had a strong desire to have our native peoples in our tribal countries become assimilated. And so much of the policies that were developed during that period of time were trying to accomplish that. And some of that even began a little bit earlier. I'll talk about that a little bit later. However, getting back to federal recognition, the Indian Reorganization Act was passed in 1934, and amended for Alaska in 1936. The three major sections of the act were Section 16, Section 17, and another section that dealt with the holding of land and trust on behalf of tribes by the federal government. Now, Section 16 is the most important for tribal governance and is used almost entirely in Alaska for that purpose. Now, Section 17 was more prominent early on in the 1940s with the Indian tribes of Southeast Alaska because they were really interested in using that to enter into businesses on behalf of tribal people within our region. And here are some of the remaining uh, trust lands in Southeast Alaska. Most everybody's familiar with the Annette Island Reserve as an Indian reservation, but you may not realize that in the organized village of Cake, the cannery and the lands around the cannery is held in trust by the federal government, very similar to lands held in trust on reservations. Same holds true in Klawock. The cannery and the lands on which it sits is all held in trust by the federal government for the tribe. Going back to the issue of our relationship with the federal government, one of the very important areas that we struggled with the United States with was the area of participation in what was happening to our people through public policy. And we found that without citizenship, Native Americans, including Alaska Natives, could not vote, they could not hold public office, participate in public meetings, own land individually. Now I say individually because many of the lands on which our people resided on during that time were village town sites held in trust by the federal government that was not owned individually by the people. And we're not able to develop our homes or even the lands on which our homes sat on without the BIA permission. Nor could our Native people attend public schools during that time. In an effort to give Native Americans citizenship, the Dawes Act was passed in 1887. That act would give you citizenship, but the Native people had to abandon the Native way of life. They could no longer have potlatches, or in our area, our coifs. You couldn't speak your native language, and you had to sign a pledge that you would be civilized. That was an affidavit that was signed and witnessed, stating that you, from there on, you would become civilized and abandon your traditional ways of living. Now, in Southeast Alaska, very few people bought into gaining citizenship in that way. As a matter of fact, almost entirely our Native people rejected the abiding by those requirements just to become a citizen. So the Alaska Native Brotherhood found that in the lower 48, there was a movement to have Indian citizenship without having to go and abandon your traditional way of life. And that led to the passage of the Indian Citizenship of 1924. And once again, that was led in Alaska by the Alaska Native Brotherhood. It's important that I point out who the Alaska Native Brotherhood is. The Alaska Native Brotherhood is one of the oldest civil rights organizations in the United States. It was founded in 1912 by 12 Native men attending the Sitka Training School, which later became Sheldon Jackson. And they were founded to fight against the injustices waged against our people. That effort by the Alaska Native Brotherhood moved on then from just gaining citizenship to fighting for our land, the land that was taken by the United States without our permission. And so the Alaska Native Brotherhood at a convention in Haines in 1929, passed a resolution to sue the federal government for the taking of our lands. Now, that resolution, with all the delegates present, passed by only one vote. And the reason for that is the Tlingit people and the Haida people and the Tsimshian people that were in attendance there were very concerned because just a few years earlier, 5 years earlier, we had just gained citizenship to the United States. And so we're not sure what suing the federal government would result in. As a matter of fact, many felt that if we were considered as a settlement to place all of our Tlingit and or Haida people in one place in our homeland, kind of like what they did in lower 48. Like the Navajo were rounded up and put in one area, and so on. There were a lot of people that really did not want to have our people gathered up and put on one reservation. And so that was why there was only a one vote victory. And as I mentioned, with taking of our land, it was both the Tongass National Forest and Glacier Bay. Now, when the Alaska Native Brotherhood took this to court, the Court of Claims rejected the suit because they had determined that only federally recognized tribes can sue the federal government over Aboriginal land rights. And so the the A&B petitioned the United States Congress to have tribal recognition of our people. And so in 1935, the Tlingit Haida Jurisdiction Act was passed. And with the passage of that act, that gave then the Tlingit and Haida tribal rights to sue the federal government. As mentioned, this was way back in 1935 when we got recognized, but from the time we began our suit, it was 39 years until we had finally a settlement. The Tlingit Haida settlement came through in 1968 for an amount of $7.5 million. Almost without exception, our people felt very insulted by the settlement because of its small amount, but they decided to accept it anyway because they were very much aware that throughout Alaska there was a push to have a settlement of all lands taken by the federal government from all Alaska Natives. And the Alaska Federation of Natives was formed in 1966. And the people of Southeast took some of those dollars that we had from our settlement and joined the AFN in the suit. And it was very important because that suit also included land. Now back to the Tlingit and Haida suit. That suit was very important because it was a suit that determined that Alaska Native people did, as a matter of fact, have Aboriginal ties to the land. And without those ties, Aboriginal land claims, suits to the government would really not be possible. Moving way into the future now, the Alaska tribes were elevated in status as to having the same recognition and authorities as tribes in the lower 48 in 1993. That was done by the Assistant Secretary Ada Deer by listing all the tribes that they recognized in the Federal Register as being officially recognized as federally recognized tribes. ANCSA corporations were not included in that, nor was Clinton Haida Central Council. Now, we were very upset about that. We objected to the administration, to the Secretary of Interior, and others within the administration, but we were not successful. And so we chose to take it to Congress. We took it to Congress and were successful in getting the Congress to agree to reinstate Clinton Haida Central Council as a federally recognized tribe 1 year later in 1994. Not only did that act recognize Clinton Haida and reinstate us as a tribe, it made it a requirement that the Department of Interior could no longer remove any tribe from the list of federally recognized tribes without the permission of Congress. Furthermore, it also solidified the status of federal recognition of tribes in Alaska, all tribes in Alaska. I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of and the positive parts about tribes in modern times. And tribal governments are very important because it identifies tribal citizenship. The tribes of modern times are much more sophisticated in not only developing and maintaining, but updating the enrollment process of the tribe. And this is very important because tribal citizens have scattered throughout the nation. It's also important because of the intermarriage of the people from one tribe to people outside a tribe. And more as time goes by, people will find that when they try to check the lineage of their own families, they find it very helpful to go to the tribe to find out the enrollment history of their particular family. And more, the belonging to and being a citizen of a tribe is important for program eligibility within a tribal jurisdiction. And you have to be a tribal citizen to participate in the governance of a tribe. Modern tribes have really come a long way rather in developing organic documents used to govern the tribe. The constitutions of the tribal governments have become much stronger. In early constitutions, it simply identified who you were and who the people were and the process for keeping yourself going, but did not identify any of the powers of tribal government. So you had to have those powers in order to get involved in federal contracting or to participate in many of the other policy development issues. Many tribes have bylaws now that help them work through how they manage their tribal government. Others have statutes and ordinances that are maintained fairly regularly to make sure that the policies of the tribe are well documented. There are also minutes kept of meetings to make sure that the history of tribal government meetings are maintained, and that those have become increasingly important in modern times when you have disputes with the federal government or within the tribe itself in settling those disputes. Rules of election are not often a separate document, but in Clinton Haida Central Council, not only is it a separate organic document, it is the only document that is approved by the Department of Interior. When Clinton Haida has to modify its rules of election, it has to have it certified by the Department of Interior. And that was embedded in the law that was created during the settlement of the Clinton-Haida Land Claim Settlement Act. We also have standing rules of order, which are simply clarifying how we conduct our meetings. Tribes are also becoming more conscious of the positive reality of having separation of powers. The legislative, the administrative, and judiciary branches of government. Now, I point out that there are overlaps, and the smaller the overlap in a well-run tribe makes it to have much more functionality without having more and more problems. So you want to create policies that minimize the overlap and have the units of the tribal government function somewhat independently. What is called the legislative are the tribal assemblies, tribal councils, or even the citizenry. In some of the small tribes, when you have their annual meetings, it's actually a composition of all your tribal citizens. And at those meetings, then they will go into the elections and formulation of policies, etc. This legislative body is the policy-making body of the tribe. They determine the future path of the tribe. They adopt the budgets. They oversee what is happening in the tribe and make sure there's accountability. They determine leadership. They appoint, in many tribes, they appoint the judiciary. In other tribes, they simply make sure that the election process of the judiciary is conducted properly. And they also determine the relationship with other governments and entities. The administrative part of a tribal government is comprised of the CEO, general management and staff, and all of the people responsible for carrying out the management of the administrative side of the government. They are actually ones that formulate and implement budgets. You might have noted in the earlier slide, I talked about the approval of those budgets are done by the legislative branch, but the actual formulation and implementation of budgets is in the administrative branch of the government. Judiciary is oftentimes made up of chief justice, a judge, or magistrates, or any combination thereof. It's important to point out that in contemporary times, or even traditional times, judiciary was done almost entirely by your legislative branch. In modern times, however, when you have the separation of powers, it's important to have these function separately. It's important to have tribal governments as a way of preservation of who we are, our identity as a people, maintaining the enrollment of our people, perpetuate our culture, art, and way of life. They're important also in providing services through programs, oftentimes entirely for the needy citizens, other times for enhancing education through early childhood, higher education assistance, helping with Indian child welfare issues, helping people with employment, and also dealing with native allotment issues, public safety, and healthcare. Our tribal governments are also very important in creating a situation of self-determination. It sets up a situation where we become proficient in administrating our own programs. We formulate our own policies. We once again formulate separation of powers. And we have practical experience in policy making and administering the various parts of our organizations. And we also have become very good at having built up our government relations with other organizations and other governments. Accountability is very important to the maintaining of tribal governments into the future, and not only accountability to government agencies and to keep in compliance with federal and state laws, but also very important in having accountability through reports to tribal citizens. More and more, as time goes by and our populations gets more dense in our countries and our homelands, and we have to deal with more and more programs affecting our people, advocacy is very important. Right now, we are dealing with issues dealing with all the way from fisheries to pollution in public policy areas, and also dealing with federal and state funding to not only our programs, but also to the communities where our people reside. One myth you may have heard about is that Native Americans can get anything they want from the federal government. All they have to do is ask. This graph, which was created in 2000 by the Congressional Budget Office, points out that till about 1980, it was true that our federal funding to Native Americans was more on a per capita basis than non-Indians. Since then, it has gone the other direction. Inflation pretty much has eaten up a lot of our federal appropriations, and so we have a very difficult time just maintaining the funding that we had, the funding levels that we had back in 1980 to where it is today. Now, this slide simply clarifies that. This slide here shows that in the years 2004 to 2012, the Indian Affairs budget within the Department of Interior grew approximately 8%. In the Fish and Wildlife part of the Department of Interior, their budget grew by approximately 30%. Park Service approximately 28%, and so on down the line. And so the growth within the Department of Interior during that period of time was very minimal for BIA funding, but very substantial in other areas. This shows in the year 2012 President's request in comparison to the 2010 enacted level. In other words, that level that was passed by Congress and signed into law by the president. Once again, the president, even during an Obama administration, had a request of funding that was much less than what other branches of the Bureau, than the Department of Interior had. Even when the funding got into the Department of, within the Department of Interior and got into the BIA budget, you see that in the years 2002 to 2008, the tribal priority allocation is the amount of money that goes to all tribal nations throughout the country. and see that the funding level, when you include the issue of inflation at that period of time, went down by approximately $57 million. Where if you go down to the central office budget, you'll see that they had a dramatic increase in their budget that far exceeded any amounts of money that went to Indian tribes through the tribal priority allocation. Now, there are many other years in between that we could show how the funding levels gradually increased and oftentimes were eaten up by inflation. But this slide here shows that within the Department of Interior, we finally have Department of Interior monies going equitably to the Bureau of Indian Affairs as it did to the National Park Service. Now that is a minor victory because these funds do not reflect the need in Indian country. They only reflect the growth that we were able to accomplish through tribal advocacy to bring ourselves up to parity within the Department of the Interior. I'm going to conclude my talk and talk about the limitations of tribes in Alaska. Most tribes in Alaska, I mentioned two that did have, or three, excuse me, that did have land, but most tribes in Alaska do not have land in the trust. In the lower 48, casinos generate a lot of income for tribes. There are none in Alaska. Tribes do not have taxing ability like municipalities do, or the state of Alaska, or even boroughs. And so that we cannot raise funds in that methodology to carry out the needs of our people through tribal governance. We have limited authority in policing as a result of Public Law 280. That means that we have to defer to the state government on misdemeanors and felonies that happen even in our tribal communities. And we cannot take non-members into tribal court. That does not only mean non-natives, it means other tribal citizens are not we're not able to try them in our court. We have weak rural economies. What I mean by talent migration is that when a person goes through high school in the village and goes on to college, he gets training and tries to find work back in his village. There's no jobs there for which he can use his education on, or there are very few jobs, and most of the time those jobs are taken by others. The other limitation is that tribes have no authority over ANCSA Corporation lands or the ANCSA corporations themselves. What I mean by federal and state funding is not discretionary. When I talk about advocacy, we have to go and lobby Congress, and that is prohibited. You cannot lobby Congress using federal or state monies. And so you have to find ways to get yourself invited to a hearing so that you can legally participate in a public hearing, even on the most important policies dealing with tribal governments. That concludes my presentation. I want to thank you very much for your kind attention. And I'm available to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thomas, President Emeritus Thomas. That's a very broad encyclopedic talk that was very useful. I have some questions that have been provided. The first one is, I was wondering if you could reflect on your years as president when you were working for a tribal entity that really didn't have land. And like you said several times, that's one of the unique characteristics of Alaskan tribes is that they're, most of them are not land-based. So that must have posed a number of problems for Tlingit and Haida as it developed. Would you care to reflect on those, please?
Yeah, very quickly. That's a whole new presentation. But when I was in Ketchikan, the tribe was able to get old A and B property to build tribal headquarters on, and we had to pay taxes to the city and borough. We lobbied everybody that we could, but ended up losing the battle because those properties were not held in trust by the federal government. At Tlingit Haida, even though much of the properties that the Andrew Hope building is built on was originally held in trust by the federal government. When it was transferred to the tribe, it lost its trust status and once again became taxable by the city and borough of Juneau. And so that's an example. And it's very, very difficult to run a government when you're having to pay those kinds of taxes out of funding that is very limited in flexibility.
Yeah, that's quite a challenge to not have a tax base, not have land for development. Yeah, I can't imagine what that would have been like trying to navigate that. Another question we have is, how can the Central Council minimize brain drain or talent migration through economic development opportunities and collaboration efforts with other Alaska Native corporations?
Well, the last comment is probably most important. You must have those kinds of collaboration. I know that in the Sealaska movement to try to stimulate rural economies, they have the Spruce Root organization, and they try to develop relationships with the local tribal governments and local corporations, so that when you have a small micro business within a community, it has a better chance to survive. It's also important, I think, that when we talk about the migration, that when people do go away to college and they go into areas like business, they can go back home and work with not only a village corporation, but also with the local entrepreneurs to do a better job in making sure that more of those local businesses, native-owned businesses, survive. And to a certain degree, that is happening in Huna, where the Huna tribe is working with Spruce Root and the village corporation to try to make sure that those small businesses don't just either sink or swim. They work together and cooperate together.
Another question we have is if you would comment on this current lawsuit brought by the tribes against Alaska Native corporations for acquiring funding under the CARES Act. They're challenging the CARES Act, which allocated some of that funding to Native corporations. Would you care to comment on that lawsuit?
Not really, but I will. I can seriously. The CARES Act funding to tribal governments was very clear that it was for tribal governments, and ANCSA corporations are not governments. Now, they were included in the definition of tribes because of the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act. But even if they're included in the definition, it's very hard to stretch that definition to make them tribal governments as defined by the Federal Tribal Recognition Act. And my personal opinion is that they should have worked with people in Congress to have the ANCSA corporations covered under the small business component of the CARES Act, like businesses in the lower 48 and even in Alaska. There is a substantial amount of money that is set aside to assist businesses work through this pandemic. As a matter of fact, there's probably more money in that pot than there is for governments.
Alrighty, another question is if you would compare the casino tribes, the casino businesses and tribes that hold them with ANCs, with Alaska Native Corporations. There's two forms of corporations. Could you compare those two?
Well, it's almost impossible because casinos in the lower 48 are part of tribal governments. They are, as a matter of fact, functioning on tribal lands held in trust by the federal government. In Alaska, we have no such relationship between the tribes and ANCSA lands. The Venati tried to bring that about, but they lost that suit. And so it's very difficult to bring about that without congressional action.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Dr. Thomas, for your lecture and your questions, your answers to questions. Oh, another question just popped up. Do you think we need to have tribes recognized in the Alaska State Constitution?
I think it'd be helpful, depending on how it was recognized. You know, if you had powers and don't have to succumb to other powers of the state, it's a good thing. But if you are recognized with very limited powers, or powers that made you a subordinate to the state, then would not be. So you have to be careful in crafting something that is going to diminish your tribal rights and make you subordinate to a state.
Well, I thank you again. SHI invites viewers to return for our next lecture by Walter Echo Hawk, entitled The Federal Indian Law Legal Framework for Native Nations in the Lower 48 States, which will be broadcast next Tuesday at noon. We have a link below the YouTube video for a survey we hope you will take a moment to complete. This will help us to continue improving our lecture series and also allow our funders to measure the impact of the program. SHI has started construction of its arts campus in downtown Juneau, which will expand opportunities for education and art. If you are interested in making a donation to the arts campus or submitting a letter of support to the Juneau Assembly for city funding, please visit sealaskaheritage.org/campus. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you, Chuck.